August 28, 1944. 1,423 hours. V-1 launch site Wolfsburg 7, Pas-de-Calais, France. Hauptmann Klaus Weber stood at the launch control bunker, watching through binoculars as the 17th Vergeltungswaffe-1 flying bomb of the afternoon climbed into the clear summer sky, its distinctive pulse-jet engine creating the characteristic buzzing roar that gave the weapon its buzz bomb nickname among Allied troops. At 38 years old, Weber had commanded this launch site for 3 months, supervising the firing of over 400 V-1s toward London, and he had developed a grim satisfaction in watching the unmanned weapons disappear toward England, carrying 1,870 pounds of high explosive to strike at the British capital. Launch 17 successful, Herr Hauptmann, reported Oberfeldwebel Ernst Hartmann, the launch chief. Weapon achieved proper trajectory, engine functioning normally, estimated time to target 42 minutes. Weber lowered his binoculars and made a notation in his launch log. 17 weapons launched since dawn, all successful departures, all properly aimed. By evening, they would complete their daily quota of 30 launches, 31-ton explosive packages delivered against England in retaliation for the Allied bombing of German cities. It was satisfying work, knowing that each successful launch meant British civilians would experience the terror Germans had endured for years. Then Weber noticed something wrong. Through his binoculars, he watched as Launch 17, which should have been 20 kilometers away by now, well over the English Channel, suddenly exploded in a brilliant flash at approximately 15 kilometers from the launch site, far short of its target. Not a mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion, but a violent mid-air explosion that transformed the V-1 into falling debris. "Hartmann, did you see that?" Weber demanded, his satisfaction turning to concern. 17 just exploded. Not engine failure, it looked like anti-aircraft fire. "Impossible, Herr Hauptmann," Hartmann replied, confusion evident in his voice. "We're barely 20 kilometers from launch. British anti-aircraft coverage doesn't extend this far into France. Their fighters can't catch our V-1s this close to friendly territory. There's nothing that should be able to intercept it at that range." What Weber and Hartmann didn't know, what no German V-weapon commander could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the debut of a defensive system so effective that it would transform the V-1 from Germany's vengeance weapon into an expensive failure. Allied anti-aircraft batteries, now equipped with VT, variable time, proximity fuses that automatically detonated shells near any target without requiring direct hits, had been specifically optimized for V-1 interception. The flying bomb's predictable straight-line flight, constant altitude of 2,000 to 3,000 feet, and unchanging speed of 400 miles per hour made it the perfect target for proximity-fused shells that simply needed to explode near the V-1 to destroy it with fragments. On August 28, 1944, Allied anti-aircraft batteries using VT fuses would shoot down 78% of all V-1s launched toward England, a single-day interception rate that exceeded anything previously achieved and marked the beginning of the end for Germany's flying bomb campaign. In the next 3 months, proximity fuses would destroy over 2,400 V-1s out of approximately 3,800 launched, turning Hitler's terror weapon into a costly demonstration of Allied technological superiority that accomplished little except consuming scarce German resources. Among the German V-1 crews launching weapons from sites across northern France were men who would watch their expensive, technically sophisticated missiles systematically destroyed by invisible Allied defenses they couldn't understand or counter. But on that August morning, they were still confident technicians who believed their weapons were unstoppable automated bombers that no defense could reliably intercept. This is the story of how American electronics destroyed German V-weapons, how automated defenses defeated automated offense, and how German launch crews learned that the vengeance weapon meant to terrorize London had become target practice for Allied anti-aircraft gunners equipped with shells that couldn't miss. The Vergeltungswaffe-1, literally Vengeance Weapon 1, represented Germany's attempt to strike back at Allied cities using unmanned weapons that required no pilots and could be mass-produced at fraction of the cost of conventional bombers. Developed by Fieseler as a simple, cheap guided missile, the V-1 used a pulse-jet engine, autopilot, and basic guidance system to fly a ballistic course toward preset coordinates. The weapon's specifications seemed impressive: 27-foot wingspan, 25-foot length, 4,750-pound launch weight including 1,870-pound warhead, 400 miles per hour cruising speed, 150-mile maximum range. Most significantly, it cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture, roughly $2,000 in 1944 dollars, compared to over $200,000 for a 4-engine bomber. Germany could build 100 V-1s for the cost of one bomber, and V-1s required no trained crews to die when shot down. The V-1 campaign began on June 13, 1944, 1 week after D-Day, with the first salvo of 10 flying bombs launched against London. Initial British defensive responses were ineffective. The V-1's speed exceeded most fighters' capability to catch it at low altitude, and conventional anti-aircraft fire struggled to hit a small, fast-moving target flying at 2,000 feet. Group Captain James Richardson, commanding RAF air defences in southeastern England, watched the first V-1 attacks with frustration. "We're facing an automated weapon that flies faster than our fighters can intercept at low altitude, smaller than conventional bombers, and launched in numbers that overwhelm our defenses," Richardson told his staff during a June planning meeting. "Our anti-aircraft guns hit perhaps one V-1 in 50 shots, acceptable for conventional bombing but inadequate against massed automated attacks. We need better interception methods or London will be pounded daily by weapons we cannot stop." The British response evolved rapidly. Fast fighters, primarily Hawker Tempests and modified Spitfire Mk-XIVs, were assigned to V-1 interception, catching the flying bombs over the English Channel before they reached land. Anti-aircraft gun belts were established along the coast with concentrated firepower zones through which V-1s had to pass. Barrage balloons forced V-1s to fly higher where fighters could intercept more easily. But the defenses remained imperfect. Throughout June and July 1944, approximately 30 to 40% of launched V-1s reached London, killing over 6,000 civilians and wounding 18,000 more. The campaign created exactly the terror and disruption Hitler intended: civilians sleeping in underground stations, evacuation of non-essential personnel, diversion of Allied resources from the Normandy campaign to defend against automated weapons. Major Wilhelm Richter, commanding a V-1 launch group in northern France, documented the campaign's early effectiveness in his July situation report: "Our weapons are achieving strategic impact exceeding expectations. British defensive measures are partially effective but insufficient to prevent most weapons from reaching targets. Fighter interception over Channel destroys perhaps 20% of weapons. Anti-aircraft fire over England destroys another 15%. Barrage balloons account for 5%. Total defensive success, approximately 40%. Remaining 60% reach target areas where they inflict casualties and force British to divert resources to defense rather than offense." Most significantly, Richter's report continued, "Our weapons require no aircrew, meaning all losses are purely material. British must commit fighters, anti-aircraft batteries, and radar coverage to stop automated weapons that Germany can replace faster than Britain can destroy them. The exchange ratio heavily favors us. We expend cheap automated missiles, they expend expensive defensive resources and suffer civilian casualties that undermine morale." But Richter's assessment, written in July, would be obsolete by September. What he didn't know, what German intelligence had no means of discovering, was that Allied scientists had already developed the weapon that would turn his cheap missiles into expensive failures. The VT proximity fuse was being rushed into mass production specifically for V-1 defense, and when it became operational in August, the entire strategic equation would reverse. The VT proximity fuse's development for V-1 defense was evolutionary rather than revolutionary. The basic technology existed and had been used against aircraft since 1943. But the specific optimization of proximity fuses for V-1 interception represented systematic application of technology to exploit the flying bomb's inherent vulnerabilities. Dr. Charles Morrison, a physicist working with the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance on proximity fuse applications, identified the V-1's exploitable characteristics in a July 1944 technical assessment. The German flying bomb presents an ideal target for proximity fuse anti-aircraft defense. Unlike piloted aircraft that maneuver unpredictably, the V-1 flies straight and level at constant speed and altitude. Unlike high-altitude bombers, it operates at altitudes where anti-aircraft fire is most accurate. Unlike fighters, it cannot take evasive action when under fire. These characteristics make it vulnerable to any defense system that can reliably place explosive shells near its flight path. VT proximity fuses, Morrison's analysis continued, eliminate the traditional weakness of anti-aircraft fire, the requirement for direct hits or very near misses against targets whose exact position is uncertain. Proximity fuses detonate automatically when within lethal range of any metal target, creating fragment patterns that destroy aircraft without requiring precise aim. Against V-1s flying predictable courses at constant altitude, proximity fuses should achieve hit rates approaching 70 to 80% provided sufficient guns are positioned along flight paths. The technical optimization involved three key elements. First, anti-aircraft batteries were repositioned along the English coast in concentrated gun belts through which all V-1s had to pass. This created kill zones where multiple guns fired simultaneously, increasing probability that at least one proximity-fused shell would explode near each V-1. Second, the proximity fuses themselves were calibrated specifically for V-1 characteristics. The radio frequency was adjusted to maximize sensitivity to the V-1's metal components. The detonation distance was optimized for the fragment pattern most likely to destroy a pulse jet engine or severing control surfaces. The arming sequence was modified to ensure shells were active at the altitudes V-1s typically flew. Third, radar fire control systems were integrated with proximity-fused guns to track V-1s from moment of radar detection to moment of destruction, feeding continuous position data to gun directors that calculated optimal firing solutions. The entire system, radar detection, automated fire control, proximity-fused shells, created an integrated defense where human operators simply authorized fire and the electronics handled everything else. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bradford, commanding the first anti-aircraft battery to receive proximity-fused ammunition optimized for V-1s, described the system during August training. Traditional anti-aircraft fire requires gunners to estimate target altitude, speed, and course, set time fuses to explode at predicted interception point, and fire salvos hoping one shell explodes near enough to damage the target. Proximity fuses eliminate most of this complexity. Radar tracks the V-1. Fire control calculates where to aim. Gunners fire. The shells handle everything else, they fly toward the predicted interception point, detect when they're near the target, and detonate automatically. The V-1 doesn't need to be exactly where we predicted. It just needs to be close enough for the shells to detect it. Against predictable targets like V-1s, Bradford continued, this should be devastatingly effective. The V-1 can't evade. Can't take evasive action. Can't vary its altitude or speed significantly. It just flies in a straight line at constant speed, making it the easiest target anti-aircraft gunners will ever engage. With proximity fuses, we don't need direct hits, we just need shells in the general vicinity, and the fuses do the rest. The first combat test of the optimized system occurred on August 17, 1944, when Bradford's battery engaged 3 V-1s in quick succession. All 3 were destroyed, requiring a total of 47 shells, an average of 16 shells per kill compared to the previous average of 50 shells per kill using conventional ammunition. The improvement was significant but not yet dramatic. What would make the system truly devastating was the combination of multiple batteries firing simultaneously, all equipped with proximity fuses, all integrated through radar and fire control, creating overlapping kill zones through which no V-1 could pass without being engaged by dozens of shells that simply needed to explode somewhere near the target to be lethal. August 28, 1944, dawned clear and calm across southeastern England, perfect flying weather that meant maximum German V-1 operations and, unknown to German launch crews, perfect conditions for the Allied defensive system to demonstrate its full capability. German V-1 launch sites across northern France had received orders for maximum effort, 30 or more launches per site, aiming to saturate British defenses through sheer numbers. German planners reasoned that even if defensive success rates reached 50%, the remaining weapons would inflict significant damage and force Britain to maintain defensive resources in England rather than committing them to the Normandy breakout. Hauptmann Klaus Weber's launch site, Wolfsburg 7, began operations at 0600 hours, with crews preparing 30 V-1s for launch throughout the day. The routine was well established by August: mount the flying bomb on its launch ramp, fuel it, set the autopilot and guidance gyroscope, conduct final checks, then ignite the pulse jet engine and release the weapon to accelerate down the ramp and into the sky. Launch 1 away, reported Oberfeldwebel Hartmann at 0612 hours. Proper trajectory achieved, weapon proceeding on course. Weber watched through binoculars as the V-1 climbed to its cruising altitude and headed northwest toward England, its pulse jet creating the distinctive buzzing sound audible even from the launch bunker. Another weapon successfully deployed, another 1,870 pounds of explosive heading toward London. Routine, professional, satisfying. What Weber couldn't see was what happened to Launch 1 as it crossed the English coast near Dover at 0634 hours. British coastal radar detected the V-1 at 18 miles range and automatically cued 6 anti-aircraft batteries positioned in overlapping coverage zones. Fire control computers calculated the V-1's course, altitude, and speed. Gun crews received automated firing solutions. At 0636 hours, when the V-1 was 4 miles offshore, the guns opened fire. The first salvo consisted of 36 shells from 6 guns, all equipped with VT proximity fuses calibrated for V-1 interception. The shells arced toward the predicted interception point, their miniature radio transmitters active, sensing for metal targets. At 2,400 feet altitude, 3 shells detected the approaching V-1 within their 70-foot activation radius and detonated automatically in sequence. The concentrated fragmentation from 3 proximity-fused shells exploding within seconds and within 100 feet of the V-1 shredded its thin metal skin, severed fuel lines, destroyed the pulse jet engine, and sent the flying bomb tumbling into the channel 3 miles from shore. Total engagement time, 18 seconds from radar detection to destruction. Shells fired, 36. Shells that needed to explode near target for kill, 3. Launch 1 from Wolfsburg 7 never reached England. Neither did launches 2 through 15. By 1400 hours, Weber's launch site had fired 16 V-1s. Intelligence from other launch sites indicated approximately 120 V-1s had been launched throughout the morning across all sites. German radar stations monitoring the channel reported something unprecedented: nearly all the V-1s were being destroyed before reaching England. Not 30%, not 50%, but closer to 80 to 90% of all weapons launched were being intercepted and destroyed over the channel or immediately after crossing the English coast. Herr Hauptmann, this cannot be correct, Hartmann reported after speaking with neighboring launch sites by field telephone. Multiple sites report that their weapons are being destroyed at impossible rates. Site Wolfsburg 5 reports 0 weapons reaching target out of 12 launched. Site Nordwind 3 reports 1 weapon of 18 may have reached England. Our own Launch 17 just exploded 20 kilometers from here, well within what should be friendly airspace. Weber studied the reports with growing alarm. The mathematics didn't make sense. British defensive capabilities in June and July had destroyed approximately 40% of V-1s. But today's interception rate appeared to be approaching 80% or higher. That level of defensive effectiveness was impossible with known British capabilities. It would require every British fighter in England to be dedicated to V-1 interception plus perfect anti-aircraft accuracy plus unknown additional defensive measures. Continue launches according to orders, Weber commanded, though his confidence was shaken. Intelligence will assess the situation. We execute our mission. But as launches 17 through 30 departed throughout the afternoon, the pattern continued. German radar tracking showed weapons exploding over the channel or shortly after crossing the English coast at rates that made the day's operations a comprehensive failure. Of 30 V-1s launched from Wolfsburg 7 on August 28, German intelligence would later confirm that only 4 reached the London target area, an 87% interception rate for that site alone. Across all German launch sites, approximately 95 V-1s were launched on August 28. Allied records would show that only 21 weapons reached their target areas, a 78% interception rate that exceeded anything previously achieved and marked the point where the V-1 campaign ceased to be militarily or strategically viable. Weber, receiving final statistics that evening, understood that something fundamental had changed in British defensive capabilities. His August 28 report to headquarters captured the crisis. Enemy defensive effectiveness has increased dramatically and inexplicably. Our weapons are being destroyed at rates exceeding 75% across all launch sites. Previous defensive success averaged 40%. Current defensive success suggests either massive increase in defensive resources we have not detected or deployment of new defensive technology with capabilities unknown to our intelligence. Assessment: V-1 campaign effectiveness has collapsed. Recommend immediate investigation and development of countermeasures. The German analysis of the August 28 catastrophe, and subsequent missions that maintained similarly high interception rates, revealed a profound confusion about Allied capabilities and a fundamental inability to identify or counter proximity fuse technology. Major Wilhelm Richter, the V-weapon commander who had praised the campaign's effectiveness in July, submitted a revised assessment in early September that acknowledged the changed situation. British defensive capabilities against our V-1 weapons have increased dramatically in late August. Current interception rates approach 75 to 80%, making the campaign economically and militarily unsustainable. We are expending significant resources, fuel, explosives, manufacturing capacity, to produce weapons that British defenses destroy with apparent ease. But Richter's analysis of why interception rates had increased was entirely speculative. Possible explanations for improved British defense: 1. Massive increase in fighter aircraft dedicated to V-1 interception, requires diverting hundreds of fighters from other missions. 2. Improved radar and fire control allowing anti-aircraft batteries to achieve higher accuracy. 3. Deployment of yet unknown defensive weapons or tactics. 4. Intelligence compromise allowing British to predict our launch patterns and concentrate defenses accordingly. German technical intelligence, analyzing fragments from destroyed V-1s recovered from the Channel, found evidence of explosive damage consistent with anti-aircraft shell fragments but nothing that explained how British guns achieved such high success rates. Some fragments showed damage from shells that had exploded very close, within 50 feet, suggesting either remarkable accuracy or some mechanism that caused shells to explode automatically near targets. The latter possibility was discussed but dismissed as technically implausible. Oberst Heinrich Steiner, a Luftwaffe technical intelligence officer, wrote in his September analysis, "We have considered possibility that British anti-aircraft shells contain some form of automatic proximity detection system. However, technical assessment concludes this is implausible given the size, weight, and acceleration constraints of artillery shells. Radio equipment sufficiently miniaturized and robust to function inside fired shells is theoretically possible but practically impossible given current electronics manufacturing limitations." This analysis, which correctly identified radar fire control and positioning but completely missed proximity fuses, would guide German countermeasure efforts for the remainder of the campaign. The focus would be on making V-1s less predictable through variable altitude programming, spiral approach patterns, and modified guidance systems. None of these countermeasures would significantly improve survival rates because they didn't address the actual problem: proximity fused shells that simply needed to explode somewhere near the V-1 to be lethal. Hauptmann Weber, continuing to launch V-1s daily from Wolfsburg 7 despite understanding most would be destroyed before reaching targets, documented the psychological impact on launch crews in his September report. Morale among launch personnel is deteriorating. Crews understand their efforts are largely futile, weapons they prepare and launch are destroyed with near certainty before reaching targets. The launches feel like expensive exercises rather than effective attacks. We continue operations because orders require it, but the sense of purposeful contribution to the war effort has been replaced by mechanical execution of increasingly pointless missions. The economic waste is staggering, Weber added. Each V-1 represents significant manufacturing resources, fuel, explosives, and transport capacity. We launch 30 weapons daily. Perhaps 6 reach targets. The resources consumed by the 24 destroyed weapons could produce conventional munitions or be allocated to more effective weapon systems. We are wasting Germany's remaining industrial capacity on automated weapons that British defenses neutralize with apparent ease. By October 1944, V-1 launches would decrease from the August peak of approximately 3,000 per month to fewer than 1,000 per month, not because launch sites were overrun, though some were as Allied forces advanced, but because German commanders understood the campaign was no longer worth the resources consumed. The Vengeance weapon had been defeated not through direct military action but through defensive technology that made it obsolete. Following the catastrophic August 28 interception rate, German V-weapon engineers frantically attempted to develop modifications that would improve V-1 survivability against the unexplained Allied defensive capabilities. Every attempted countermeasure would fail because German engineers were solving the wrong problem, trying to make the V-1 less predictable when the actual threat was proximity-fused shells that didn't require predictable targets to be lethal. Oberingenieur Franz Schmidt, heading the V-1 modification program at Peenemünde, received urgent orders in early September to develop variants that could evade British defenses. His team's first solution was the diving approach, programming V-1 autopilots to descend from cruise altitude to 500 feet for the final approach to target, theoretically making them harder for anti-aircraft guns to track and fighters to intercept. The diving approach modification entered operational testing on September 15, 1944. Hauptmann Klaus Weber's launch site, Wolfsburg 7, received 10 modified V-1s with instructions to monitor whether the new approach improved survival rates. Weber launched all 10 throughout the day, carefully tracking each weapon through German radar as long as possible. The results were disappointing but predictable. Of the 10 diving approach V-1s, 8 were destroyed over the channel or immediately after crossing the English coast, the same 80% interception rate affecting standard V-1s. The diving approach made no difference because proximity-fused shells worked as effectively at 500 feet as at 2,000 feet. The V-1s still flew predictable courses, still maintained constant speed, and still presented large metal targets that proximity fuses detected easily regardless of altitude. The modifications accomplished nothing, Weber reported after the failed test. British defenses destroy modified weapons at the same rate as standard weapons. Whatever defensive capability they have deployed, it is not affected by our altitude changes. We are wasting engineering resources developing variants that make no measurable difference in survival. The second German countermeasure was the spiral approach, programming autopilots to fly spiral patterns during final approach, theoretically making the flight path less predictable. This modification was technically complex, requiring sophisticated gyroscopic controls that were difficult to manufacture and often malfunctioned, causing V-1s to crash into the channel before reaching England. Of 30 spiral approach V-1s tested in late September, 12 malfunctioned and crashed, 15 were destroyed by Allied defenses, and 3 reached target areas, a 10% success rate that was actually worse than standard V-1s achieved. The spiral approach made weapons less reliable without improving survivability. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bradford, commanding the Allied anti-aircraft battery that had been first to use VT fuses against V-1s, observed the German modifications with professional interest. "We've noticed they're trying different approach profiles, diving attacks, spiral patterns, altitude variations. None of it matters. Our proximity fuses detect metal targets regardless of altitude or flight path. As long as our shells explode somewhere near the V-1, the fragments will destroy it. The Germans are trying to make themselves harder to hit when we don't need to hit them, we just need to get close." The third and most desperate German countermeasure was the jammer V-1, weapons equipped with experimental radio jamming equipment designed to disrupt British radar and fire control. German engineers theorized that if British defensive success depended on radar tracking, jamming might reduce interception rates. The jammer V-1s were expensive, complex, and produced in limited numbers due to electronic component shortages. 20 were manufactured and launched in October 1944. 18 were destroyed by Allied defenses. The jamming equipment, operating on wrong frequencies and insufficient power, had no effect on the actual threat, proximity fuses that detected targets through their own radio transmissions rather than external radar. Every countermeasure fails, Major Wilhelm Richter wrote in his October situation assessment. We have attempted altitude changes, approach pattern modifications, and electronic jamming. British interception rates remain 75 to 80% regardless of our modifications. Either their defensive system is so robust that our countermeasures cannot affect it, or we are attempting to counter the wrong threat. Assessment: continued V-1 operations are not militarily justifiable given resource expenditure versus results achieved. By November 1944, the V-1 campaign had effectively collapsed as both an operational and strategic weapon. The numbers told the story of comprehensive defeat through defensive technology German engineers couldn't understand or counter. Total V-1s launched September-November 1944, approximately 4,200 weapons. Total reaching target areas, approximately 850, a 20% success rate compared to the 60% achieved in June-July before VT fuses were optimized for V-1 defense. The 80% interception rate meant that for every V-1 that reached London, 4 were destroyed over the Channel or English countryside at costs Germany could no longer afford. The economic calculation was brutal. Each V-1 cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture plus fuel, transportation, and launch site operations. Launching 4 V-1s to achieve one successful attack cost 20,000 Reichsmarks plus operational expenses, nearly the cost of a fighter aircraft that could be reused for multiple missions. The supposed economic advantage of cheap automated weapons had been negated by defensive technology that destroyed them at unsustainable rates. Vice Admiral Werner Hoffmann, responsible for coordinating V-weapon production and deployment, submitted a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis to High Command in November that recommended terminating the campaign. V-1 operations are consuming resources that exceed their strategic value. We are allocating steel, explosives, fuel, and electronics to weapons that British defences neutralise with 80% effectiveness. The remaining 20% that reach targets inflict damage, but at costs 5 times higher than originally projected. More critically, Hoffmann's analysis continued, the resources consumed by V-1 production could be reallocated to fighters, conventional bombers, or ground weapons where they would provide greater military value. We are producing 3,000 V-1s monthly. That production capacity represents steel for 600 fighter aircraft, explosives for 15,000 artillery shells, or fuel for 200 bomber sorties. All of these alternatives would contribute more effectively to German war effort than automated weapons that British defences destroyed before reaching targets. But Hitler, viewing the V-weapons as retaliation for Allied bombing of German cities, refused to authorize campaign termination. V-1 launches would continue through March 1945, though at steadily declining rates as launch sites were overrun by Allied advances and as even the most dedicated V-weapon personnel understood their efforts were futile. Hauptmann Weber, commanding Wolfsburg 7 through November, documented the psychological deterioration in his final monthly report. Personnel have requested transfers to conventional units where they feel their efforts contribute meaningfully to defense, Weber added. I have denied these requests because orders require continued operations, but I cannot argue that their assessment is wrong. We are operating an expensive, ineffective weapon system because High Command refuses to acknowledge its obsolescence. This is not warfare. It is waste. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, one of the first technical intelligence priorities for Allied forces was preventing Soviet acquisition of V-weapon technology and ensuring German scientists understood why their weapons had failed so comprehensively. The revelation of VT proximity fuse capabilities would shock German engineers who had struggled futilely to counter defenses they couldn't identify. Oberengineer Franz Schmidt, the V-1 modification specialist who had developed the diving and spiral approach variants, was interrogated by British technical intelligence in June 1945. When shown an actual VT proximity fuse with its internal components explained, his reaction, documented in interrogation transcripts, captured the moment of understanding. You had radio transmitters in the shells? Miniaturized electronics that could survive firing forces? This explains everything. We theorized such technology might exist but deemed it impossible given electronics manufacturing constraints we understood. We were solving the wrong problem, Schmidt continued, examining the fuse components with professional fascination. We attempted to make our V-1s less predictable because we believed your success came from improved prediction and tracking. But prediction didn't matter when your shells automatically detonated near any target. Our altitude changes, spiral approaches, jamming equipment, all irrelevant when facing weapons that simply needed proximity to be lethal. The technical achievement is remarkable, Schmidt admitted. These miniature vacuum tubes, the battery activation system, the radio frequency optimization, you solved engineering problems we thought unsolvable. More significantly, you mass-produced these complex fuses and deployed thousands monthly. We couldn't have manufactured equivalent systems even if we'd understood the principle. The industrial capacity disparity that defined the entire war manifested in proximity fuses as absolute Allied superiority. German interrogations revealed another critical failure. Intelligence had identified the possibility of proximity fuses, but Luftwaffe leadership had dismissed it as Allied deception. Several V-1 fragments recovered from the channel showed damage patterns consistent with very close shell explosions, and some fragments had been found near unexploded anti-aircraft shells with suspicious nose fuses. But German analysts, unable to believe Allied engineers had overcome miniaturization and ruggedization challenges, had attributed the evidence to coincidence or conventional fire control improvements. We saw the evidence but didn't believe it, admitted Oberst Heinrich Steiner, the Luftwaffe intelligence officer who had analyzed V-1 defensive measures. Your proximity fuses required technical capabilities we thought beyond current electronics manufacturing. We convinced ourselves you'd achieved remarkable fire control coordination rather than admit you'd solved problems we deemed unsolvable. That analytical failure cost us months of continued V-1 operations that accomplished nothing except wasting resources. The psychological impact on German V-weapon personnel was significant when they learned the truth. Hauptmann Weber, who had commanded Wolfsburg 7 through the campaign's most futile months, was interviewed by British historians in 1952 and reflected on the revelation. Learning about proximity fuses explained our helplessness. We'd struggled for months attempting countermeasures against a threat we couldn't identify. We'd blamed ourselves for inadequate modifications when actually no modification could have succeeded. The technology gap was absolute. You had automated target detection we couldn't replicate or counter. The waste haunts me, Weber continued. We launched thousands of V-1s knowing most would be destroyed but not understanding why defenses were so effective. We consumed Germany's dwindling resources on weapons that were obsolete before we even finished deploying them. If we'd known about proximity fuses in August 1944, rational analysis would have demanded campaign termination. But we didn't know, and Hitler wouldn't have terminated even if we had, so we continued wasting resources on pointless retaliation that accomplished nothing except demonstrating Allied technical superiority. The human stories from both sides of the V-1/VT fuse confrontation revealed the personal dimensions of technological warfare where automated weapons faced automated defenses and humans simply watched outcomes determined by electronics. Captain Robert Morrison, an anti-aircraft battery commander who had destroyed over 40 V-1s using proximity-fused ammunition between August 1944 and March 1945, described the experience in a 1960 interview. It wasn't heroic combat. We didn't see brave enemies to face an honorable battle. We saw automated weapons flying predictable courses, and we fired shells equipped with automated fuses. The electronics handled everything. Our radar detected them, our fire control calculated trajectories, our proximity fuses detonated automatically when near targets. We just authorized fire and watched weapons explode. Sometimes I thought about the German crews who launched those V-1s, Morrison reflected. Knowing their weapons would probably be destroyed, knowing they were wasting Germany's resources on missions that accomplished little. They were professionals doing their duty, but their duty was futile because we had technology they couldn't counter. That's modern warfare, technology determining outcomes more than courage or skill. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Hartmann, Weber's launch chief at Wolfsburg 7, survived the war and provided testimony about the psychological toll of operating weapon systems known to be ineffective. By October 1944, we all understood the V-1s weren't working. We'd watch them launch successfully, track them on radar toward England, then watch them disappear from radar as British defenses destroyed them. Day after day, the same pattern. Expensive weapons destroyed before reaching targets. We felt like we were feeding machines designed to consume resources rather than contributing to any meaningful military objective. The crews developed dark humor, Hartmann recalled. We'd bet on how far each V-1 would get before being destroyed. We'd celebrate if one actually reached England, not because we wanted British civilians dead, but because it meant our work had achieved something beyond waste. That's what it came to, celebrating when 20% of our weapons weren't destroyed as futile gestures. The campaign influenced Cold War military doctrine regarding missile defense and automated warfare. U.S. and Soviet planners studying the V-1's failure understood that automated weapons required defensive countermeasures that could be defeated or else they became expensive failures. The recognition that electronics and detection systems mattered as much as warhead size or speed influenced decades of missile development. Perhaps most significantly, the V-1/VT fuse confrontation demonstrated that expensive technological solutions could fail completely when adversaries deployed superior counter-technology. Germany had invested substantial resources in V-1 development and production only to see them systematically destroyed by Allied proximity fuses that cost less per unit than the weapons they destroyed. The V-1 campaign taught a lesson that remains relevant, wrote defense analyst Herman Kahn in his 1960 analysis of nuclear warfare. Expensive offensive systems can be rendered obsolete by relatively cheap defensive systems if the defensive technology exploits inherent vulnerabilities in the offense. Automated weapons following predictable paths are vulnerable to automated defenses with superior detection. This principle applies to missiles, drones, or any automated system. If the defense can detect and engage automatically, the offense must either become unpredictable or be destroyed systematically. In 1984, at a military technology symposium in London, German and British veterans of the V-1 campaign met to discuss the technical and operational lessons. Hauptmann Weber, now 78, met Lieutenant Colonel Bradford, 74, who had commanded the anti-aircraft battery that pioneered VT fuse use against V-1s. "I wanted to ask," Weber said through a translator, "did your crews understand how revolutionary the proximity fuses were? Did they know they were using technology we couldn't counter?" Bradford's answer was honest, "Not initially. My crews just knew the new fuses worked better than the old ones, more V-1s destroyed per shell fired. The technical sophistication, the miniaturized radios, automatic detonation, all of it, they understood that later. During operations, they just did their jobs, track targets, fire shells, watch targets explode. The electronics handled the complexity." "Did you ever think," Weber asked, "about the resources we wasted because we couldn't counter your technology? Thousands of V-1s manufactured, launched, destroyed. Millions of Reichsmarks spent accomplishing nothing?" Bradford considered carefully. "Yes, especially after learning how much each V-1 cost to build. You were spending 5,000 Reichsmarks per weapon, and we were destroying 80% of them with shells costing maybe $50 each including the proximity fuse. The economic equation heavily favored us, and you had no way to change it because you couldn't match our electronics." Weber's final reflection captured the personal dimension. "Knowing now about proximity fuses, I understand our failure wasn't lack of effort or courage. It was technological disadvantage we couldn't overcome. You had superior electronics, superior industrial capacity, and we had determination without the means to make determination matter. That's the lesson I take from the campaign. In modern warfare, technology often decides outcomes regardless of how hard both sides try." Bradford's response acknowledged the broader implications. Technology mattered more than tactics or courage in the V-1 campaign. "But I'll note that technology alone wasn't sufficient. We needed the industrial capacity to produce proximity fuses by the thousands, the tactical organization to position guns effectively, and the determination to optimize defensive systems for V-1 characteristics." Technology enabled our victory, but systematic application of that technology made it decisive. The final assessment perhaps belongs to Air Marshal Hill, who commanded V-1 defenses during the campaign. In his 1961 memoir, he reflected, "The V-1's defeat demonstrated warfare's evolution from individual heroism to systematic technological application. We defeated Germany's vengeance weapon not through desperate courage but through electronics that worked automatically, industry that produced sophisticated components reliably, an organization that integrated technology into effective systems." That's modern warfare, less dramatic than individual combat, but ultimately more decisive. The V-1 failed because we had better electronics than Germany could counter. That simple technological advantage saved thousands of British lives and rendered billions of Reichsmarks of German investment worthless.